thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Susan Bell. I'm the co-president of the Greenville League, and it's nice to see so many familiar names and faces. Even though we have to keep meeting virtually, it's still nice to be able to interact a little bit. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our presentation tonight on civics in South Carolina schools. We are really privileged to have two experts in that field to speak to us. Dr. Sharda Jackson Smith, who is also a member of our board at the local level, and she's a member of the board at the state level, and Dr. Rebecca Muller. They are both assistant professors at USC Upstate. Dr. Jackson Smith is an assistant professor of elementary education, and Dr. Muller is an assistant professor of social studies. So we are very, very happy to have them speak to us. We are recording the presentation tonight, and you'll get a link to that a little bit later in the week. Please use the chat for any questions that you have, and they'll respond to them as they can. And then I think that's pretty much all in the way of introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jackson Smith and let her tell us about what's going on in the schools. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. All right. Just to recap, in this workshop, we're going to explore some of the civic standards that's presented at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. And we're also going to review some of the recent bills that's presented at the State House. Later on tonight, we're going to be prompted to think about what do you believe should be offered in schools, and we will try and help guide you towards advocacy in that moment. Before I begin, I want to make sure that we discuss that what is being taught in schools and what is at stake of changing per State House bills. It's important to us because we are a nonpartisan organization. So we advocate for issues that affect our members and the greater public. Considering the political environment we operate in and the topics discussed tonight, I want to say that generally we operate in and on topics discussed considering critical race theory. Critical race theory is not a term that the League typically uses. We prefer a culturally inclusive history curriculum, but we all believe in acknowledging systemic structures that might hinder a group of people. And so the word cloud that you see on the screen is based on a myriad of terms reflecting diversity in our organization that we value. And we believe that there should be no barriers to full participation in our organization. And we believe the same thing for education systems. And so with that being said, I'd like to focus our attention and our energy on Dr. Muller.
Hi. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of what the civics curriculum, how civics is integrated into social studies in South Carolina. As I'll mention, what is laid out in the standards, I'm going to focus on the standards document, does not provide a robust picture of what's happening in classrooms because that is so different across spaces and influenced, as Sharda will talk about, by various factors. But my job is to kind of give you a baseline of how civics is integrated and the view of civics that comes through in the state social studies standards. But I'll start by reminding us that schools' responsibility to prepare citizens has been evident from the origins of education, both in formal and informal approaches to schooling, public and private approaches to schooling. But it's definitely citizenship and preparing students to be citizens is definitely built into the fabric of public schooling. And civics is most associated with social studies curriculum, but we see civic education in other aspects of school life in ways that ideas about citizenship are communicated beyond the formal curriculum. So saying the Pledge of Allegiance is an example of civic education. Veterans Day ceremonies are examples of civic education. Good citizen recognitions are examples of civic education. So you see it explicitly in the curriculum, but you also see it implicitly in what schools value and highlight and the broader kind of traits and dispositions that they discuss and that they advocate for in their classrooms. Concerns are regularly voiced about the state of civic education across history. Sometimes those are driven by your comical person on the street interviews where some late night comedian goes out and asks if people know who the first president was or how many branches of government there are or what the 19th Amendment is. And we all look like we don't know anything. Sometimes it's driven by low voter turnout or concerns about electoral participation. And sometimes it's driven by the intense partisan divide. Sometimes that is a reflection of what elements of civic action are emphasized. So is it that we care about knowledge, that we care about voting, that we care about discourse, and different groups kind of emphasize different aspects of it. So in the next slide, for those of you who are interested in a deeper dive on, in some ways, the national level, and they're going to put these links in the chat for you. And if you need some additional information, let me know. These are some more recent reports that you might want to consult if you're interested in civic education more broadly. I'll mention a little bit about each of them. Circle, which is out of Tufts University, does a lot of work in civic education, and they've done it for a long time. And their most recent report about what the research says identifies about 8 different main points. Some of it is the idea that youth are influenced by what they see and hear in the community. They are getting different messages and they're bringing those messages to school. So students are receiving different messages about what it means to be a citizen and what citizenship includes, and if civic activism gets you anything, and they're bringing those messages with them to school. And Circle argues that those diverse messages are actually valuable, and it pushes students to think more rigorously about citizenship and about engagement. They also emphasize that real-world practice of civic behaviors is central to civic education. So it's not just about content, it's about practicing the skills of citizenship. They also do, as you can see with that second one, youth voter turnout reports. So they have them for different regions, including the South. South Carolina's youth voter turnout increased 10% from 2016 to 2020, came in at about 45% for youth in 2020, which is lower than the national average, but increased for over those 4 years. If you'd like kind of a broader scope of the history of civic education, you might take a look at the Brookings Institute report, which looks at kind of the history and the evolution and current recommendations for civic education. And for any of you who attended the lead day, the folks who were in the panel with me, Mr. Mark Turner mentioned Educating for American Democracy, which is one of the latest kind of curricular movements for civic education, which was developed by a conglomerate of groups that are interested in civic education. It's in essence providing some guidelines that might shape how states and organizations approach civic education. And it's focused, these 2 images at the bottom are screenshots of what they identify as the 7 themes of civic education, and also the 5 design challenges, which is a really interesting aspect, which I haven't seen in a lot of curriculum guidelines before. Like, they're admitting that this is hard, and you got to think about what's hard and getting through those challenges. But there's a lot of information on that website if it feels a little daunting. Dr. Jane Lowe out of Michigan State University, who worked with that group, did a really accessible article in Social Education, and that's what that last link is to. So that kind of gives you some national. So let's take a look at the situation in South Carolina. And we'll start with some basics. Every South Carolina student is required to take a government course, and that for most students is in their senior year in high school. Every South Carolina student is required to take and pass an exam related to civics or citizenship Often that looks like a slice of questions. I think it's maybe 50 questions taken from citizenship and naturalization tests, and then what schools do with it is kind of up to them. South Carolina is one of 15-ish states that have that requirement. And then Civics is integrated throughout the curriculum. The most recent standard, the current standards, they were just fully implemented this year, of the South Carolina Social Studies standards. We'll refer to them as 2019 because that's when they were adopted. And the link to those was dropped into the chat in case you want to follow along or read them on your own time. But Civics is integrated into all of the curriculum, and it is identified as a core social studies discipline. So what I want to do next is just give you some insight on what Civics, how Civics is addressed in the curriculum at each of the grade bands. And what I'd like you to kind of keep in mind is, and be thinking about, is how civic action is addressed in these standards. As a part of this organization, you know that citizenship is not a passive exercise. And so I want you to be thinking about how the standards emphasize, do they emphasize, and how they emphasize the active nature of civics, and how the standards are encouraging educators to create space for students to actually practice civic skills. So we'll start with K through 12, and you can keep going. You can do the whole thing there, Sharda, if you want to. So K through 12, as in many places, is built on kind of an expanding circles approach, where in kindergarten, they focus on their community, and in first grade, they focus on South Carolina, and in second grade, they focus on the United States. It's kind of moving further and further away from them. But there are 4 themes in the K through 2 curriculum, and one of them is civics and government. So you can see the text of that theme here. Encourages the study of citizens' role and responsibility, including the study of rules, authority, consequences within their community. There's lots of focus on rules in K2. Lots of focus on rules. Go back real quickly. So you can see at the bottom just an example of how the expectations build across K1 and 2. The top line is an example of something that's a little bit more content oriented, but I definitely want to bring your attention to that second row. Then in kindergarten, they're collaborating with others to identify an issue and propose a resolution. In first grade, collaborating with others on local and state issues. And 2, using evidence to propose and communicate a resolution to a national issue. So I think it's really important to emphasize that from the very beginning, the standards express a commitment to civic action, and suggesting that civic action is not something that you wait until you're 18 to do. It's something you can do when you're 5. And I think that's a valuable thing to emphasize. So now please go on to the next one, Sharda. Thank you. So when we go into grades 3 through 5, the explicit inclusion of civics starts to wane a little bit. But there are opportunities to weave civics in depending on how teachers address the themes that are associated with each of the grades. So grade 3 is world geography. It doesn't come up, civics doesn't come up in the curriculum, but there are places to discuss particularly policy issues, to discuss environment, to discuss immigration, to discuss migration. So there's opportunities kind of for global and regional citizenship, depending on how teachers approach it. Grades 4 and 5 are both the United States and South Carolina history, but split across those 2 years. And in these cases, there's a theme recommended for each of the grades that has a civic education focus, mostly about kind of foundational principles and documents. So you can see that across 3, 4, and 5, there's a focus on traditional political history, a greater focus on government as actors as opposed to citizens as actors, which is a bit of a shift from what they were talking about in K1 and 2. So they kind of move away from citizenship action or civic action, action, and more toward government action. When you move to the middle grades, right, as with grades 3, 4, and 5, there's not explicit inclusion of civics beyond kind of referencing founding documents and other historical examples. But again, you do see opportunities for teachers to address specific examples maybe of civic action. So 6th grade is world civilizations. So we see, and I have it bolded here, recommendations that students examine particular, so specifically women's suffrage movement is identified there, civil rights movement, various independence movements. So elements of historic citizenship are integrated into the curriculum. 7th is a geography course, and it's regional, and I would be very surprised if teachers are doing much civic education in 7th grade. And then 8th grade, we return to South Carolina and the United States. Again, I've bolded some aspects of the indicator that I think is useful: civic participation in different individuals and groups, civic engagement, political activism. So depending on how a teacher frames this, they could, like 3, 4, 5, be focused more on government as actor, or they could be more focused on citizen as actor or organization as actor, depending on their approach. So when we move into high school, not surprisingly, we see the most robust inclusion of civics in the high school curriculum. A lot of times the public starts to pay more attention as students approach voting age, but I would argue that people can engage in civic action at any age and in lots of different ways, but it's pretty traditional to see it emphasized here. In high school, it's not organized by grade, 9, 10, 11, 12, it's just subjects. So that's how I've organized it here. So the human geography course, there's a potential to talk about issues of civics relating to political space and political organization. And modern world history, again, there's kind of an opportunity to talk about it through this theme of foundations of government and state building. There's going to be a lot of focus on the revolutionary period, both in the United States and abroad. And then coming back around to ideas of global citizenship and the roles and responsibilities of being a member of a global society, not just your local society. Once you get into the United States and Constitution course, civics gets much, much more explicit attention in the specific themes, and then also in kind of the key concepts and the specific indicators. And I won't talk about the structure of the document. If you go back into the standards, you can kind of see what I mean by theme and key concept and indicator. What I've shown you here is an example of the indicators for one particular theme. So the theme is, or the key concept is foundations of American republicanism. And so every single indicator has a connection to at least kind of civic knowledge, not necessarily civic practice, but civic knowledge. And you can see that emphasized there. Another thing just to know, just for kind of understanding well, no, I have it organized differently. So I'm not going to explain that. It'll just be too confusing. So we'll finish with kind of the focus on the United States government course. Again, this is a course that students are required to take. It's a half credit class that most students take during the end of during their senior year. And it is the one that is most directly focused on civic education. It is built around 3 themes. Civic engagement, which focuses on the importance of active participation in a constitutional democracy. Political values and institutions, which focuses on founding documents and philosophies, the context in which these documents were created, and the development of a constitutional democracy over time. And then process of law, which focuses on the creation, execution, and interpretation of law. So that's kind of the content piece. But what I want to draw your attention to down here at the bottom are the deconstructed skills. The new content standards, social studies standards, are focused on disciplinary skills. They're all built around skills. And so the skills reflect what it means to do that discipline. So the 4 skills that are associated with the government class are establishing relationships, interpreting, communicating conclusions, and then informed participation. So that is identified as a skill that is associated with the government course. And what you see in the block of text next to it is how the state standards kind of articulate what informed participation means. So by the end of this 12th grade course, students should be able to, or in the course of, or throughout this course, Students should be using acquired knowledge to participate in the political process as informed citizens, to participate in community events, to develop higher levels of collaboration, problem solving, and interpersonal skills. That might relate to our earlier question before we formally got started about voter registration. And utilize, this one too, utilize technology, resources, and critical thinking skills to discern legitimacy and detect bias at the local, state, national, and global level. So as articulated in the standards, informed participation is about doing. And so before we go to the next slide, I want you to kind of think in your head about if these are the outcomes, if this is what it means to do this skill, to engage in informed participation, what should the standards say, right? What should students then, what should be the details that teachers follow when they organize their class? So what you see on the next slide are the actual standards of the government class and the informed participation indicator. So what it means. So you see the first standard that's focused on the historical and philosophical principles. And then the indicator, the informed participation indicator for that is to investigate and communicate the importance of those principles. The standard 2 is about understanding the structure of the government. The informed participation indicator is to synthesize why the rule of law has a central place. Standard 3 is about understanding the political process. The indicator explain how the electoral process works. And then standard 4 is looking at rights and responsibilities of citizenship. And then the indicator is describe and evaluate the citizens can participate. So I get to the end of this and I get a little sad, because I see a real disconnect between how informed participation is explained and how it's expressed in the actual indicators of the standards. The indicators come across as really knowledge focused, being able to explain, not action focused, not doing, which is how the skill is described. And I think the reason that I find that particularly disheartening is because if you think all the way back to kindergarten, right, the very, very beginning, they were saying, use information to do something, use information to make your classroom better or your community better. And yet, oh, it's dark in my office, sorry. And yet we don't see that showing up in the high school class the way that I would like it to, on paper at least. So that's what the standards say. What teachers are doing, as I mentioned, is a different matter that's influenced by a myriad of factors, personal and, as Sharda will articulate, political.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Muller, for talking about informed participation. In fact, that is why we're here today. So the question is, why are we talking about civics education in K-12, particularly at this moment? What we know is that there are several bills at the State House that require attention. Either they are questioning civics education or an inclusive history curriculum. When I began contemplating which bills we would discuss tonight, there were several bills that I wanted to dive deep within while we were together, and Rebecca can attest to this. But then I was like, you know what, maybe I need to narrow it down a bit. And so I narrowed it down to 3 different bills, just to not overwhelm the evening. And then I narrowed it down to one. And I narrowed it down to one largely because I wanted us to focus and look at how a bill can be structured and how each and every caveat of each part of the bill can be questioned. And if you love reading bills as much as I do, you notice that much of the bills that are on the floor contain the same language with different titles with small changes. And I kind of look at this as throw it at the wall and see if it sticks. I believe that questioning and deriving conclusions at each part of the bill will equip us to defend our democracy. And so for today, the bill that I have chosen for us to spend some time exploring is House Bill 4343. But before I get there, I just really quickly want to talk about some of the other bills that are mentioned. So similar to House Bill 4392, which is Keep Partisanship Out of Civics Act, it was referred to the Committee on Education of the Public Works back in 2021. And in summary, it asked to protect the dignity and rights of all individuals, to be free from ideological coercion and indoctrination in places of learning, childcare, and employment that receive or benefit from state funds or accommodations directly or indirectly. And when I read the summary, I started to think about the words that were chosen, words like coercion, indoctrination, places of learning, accommodations, all of them had my brain racing. And I thought about the word rights. Rights is something that we're used to saying being defended. It's a word that is often used in not only civics education, but social science at large. So the word that we don't always see in policies is the word dignity. And the word dignity to me feels a bit subjective, a little bit open for interpretation or scrutiny. And that was certainly through my layman's eye. And I started to move to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, old school. I decided to look and see, how does Merriam define dignity? And how does that relate to academic integrity, the thing that we're going to talk about most tonight? And Merriam defines dignity as a way of appearing or behaving that suggests seriousness or self-control. And then the second definition, which I think is more suitable for what we're talking about tonight, is the quality of being worthy of honor or respect. And based on that definition, I know that as I read through the text, I need to focus squarely on at what point would the quality of being worthy of honor or respect be in question. And that somehow, somewhere in our education system, a group of people have been led to believe that in terms of academic integrity, this idea of being worthy of honor or respect is under attack. And so fine, at this point, I go directly to the bill and I look to see what types of words are used to question a person's integrity, something that would make someone believe that they are no longer dignified. The bullet points on this slide really start to parse out some of the things that fuel where a person's dignity is being questioned or a person's rights are under attack. And earlier I mentioned House Bill 4392, Keep Partisanship Out of Civics Act, which addresses this. This bill encompasses much of the same language. And this bill, however, directly has language that shows the origins of the intent. So we see things like instructional materials and curricula. We see things like Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 project, and we see things relating to the funding of education, such as withholding funding in violation of the proposed policy, all relating to history or social studies education. And so with that being said, I think, what is the context of upon which this bill is written? We know that back in 2020, ideas concerning diversity, equity, and inclusion, alongside social justice and political contention, appeared to be on high alert. And we know that they are still very high. So in a bill that addresses instructional materials and curricula and the 1619 project simultaneously, I know that there is an attempt to preserve ideological coercion and indoctrination by prohibition. So this is an active rebuke of the notion that slavery and its aftermath is an embedded current construct in America, one that is essential to the American narrative. And so I take you right to a bill here. We're looking at section 5929, 650, which directly calls out civics education by name. As you read into the bill a bit further, we see that public education is being referenced in terms of connecting it to a grant that is provided by the United States Department of Education, relating directly to history or civics education. The first two bullet points are to be expected. This idea that anything that would be funded through federal dollars be subject to an application of some sort. And even the last one, where it says there should be a complete listing of curricula and instructional materials to be used, is not necessarily something that is unheard. But for the state of South Carolina, where we specifically call out history or civics education, rather than the entire curriculum, is something to be noticed as well. It's something to be questioned too. So why are we requiring so much detail and labor-intensive work on behalf of teachers, ones that we would require to be certified? What is it about history or civics education that would cause one to believe that there is a lack of academic integrity specifically, or that someone's dignity needs to be restored or maintained? So to remind us that we are discussing academic integrity, there are parts of this particular policy that relates to students, and there are things that relate to employees, such as teachers or administrators, staff members. I think it's important that we slow down a little bit and look at to whom are we asking what? How are we attempting to preserve dignity? And how are we going about doing that? How are we making sure that we maintain honor and respect? So this section says that a public school district may not direct or otherwise compel is a big word here, compel students to personally affirm, adopt, or adhere to any of the following tenets and all the things that its proponents are seeking to preserve in the name of integrity. For the most part, these bullet points are straightforward and seem to be common sense, but as you can tell by the last bullet, we are beginning to get somewhere in terms of where someone's dignity can be stripped. This idea of being responsible for actions committed in the past. This does lend itself to ideas that might suggest that there is a race that can be seen as responsible for actions. And so what this piece of legislation is saying is that no one student should be compelled to affirm these ideas. Another keyword I won't define by Miriam is inherently. That's brought up quite a bit. So far, everything seems to be common sense. These are things that as the league we support, that no one is inherently superior based on some construct, or that someone is inherently responsible because of a particular designation. Part B is interesting though, because it starts to parse this out a little further. It says a distinction or classification of students may not be made on account of race or color. And it's interesting at this point to me because before the legislation called out a bunch of different identifiers, but here it kind of narrows in on this race or color, which is interesting, something to think about. When you move down to section C in this policy, we're getting closer to what I believe is the primary notion of this bill. Here in this policy, we talk about course of instruction or unit of study, directing or otherwise compelling students to personally adopt or adhere to any of the tenets identified in the previous subsection A. So now we're moving from the idea that no one should inherently feel a certain way, that they shouldn't be taught in a way that compels them to adopt the aforementioned principles. So this, my friends, is where I ask you to form an opinion, just like Dr. Muller referenced earlier. I want you to think specifically to those things students were taught in primary, early childhood education. Start thinking about, are these the things that they were previously told that they need to do? Are we still supporting that through these policies? Part D. This, the language broadens from the student and it starts to talk about instruction, course of instruction. But here we see other indicators being pointed out again. We're talking about the student, administrator, teacher, staff member, other school or district employees, volunteers. They may not be required to engage in any form of mandatory gender or sexual diversity training or counseling. So we've singled out race and color at some point, and now we've singled out gender or sexual diversity. All of this in the name of academic integrity. At this point, I want to remind you that this is called academic integrity. And the goal is to potentially preserve dignity when we look at bills that have similar language in it. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you a series of words that are used, and it's going to require us to kind of squint a little bit. There's a lot there. The beginning starts much like that we've already seen, that we've already read, but I'm going to show you where it starts to get even more specific. So here we see 8 parts. It said that a student, administrator, teacher, staff member, or other school or district employee may not be required to create or participate in a professional development training or a course that includes those concepts that are listed. The idea that one cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect due to the ideas identified, many of these bullets, these are things that we already believe. So on the surface, at least, these things are already regarded as unacceptable. Generally speaking, a required training that adopts these concepts is not something that's actually in place at any public institution for the most part, right? That's the thing that should make us put up kind of like that light bulb or make us go, So when we address teaching, a fine line is approached. Teaching about constructs that did exist in the past is an explicit way to show what is important. Students must understand that in the past, and some would argue now, that many people believe that these ideas, were okay, that they're fine. The real issue, as number 7 articulates, is to do away with constructs that make or could make a person feel discomfort or guilt or anguish. These things we don't want students to feel. But remember, teaching about constructs of the past is not an endorsement. It is only to teach about what has happened in the past. A skilled teacher monitors the way that these topics are discussed. A skilled teacher can manage critical thinking. Talking about the Trail of Tears or the Civil War, these things have always been a source of discussion that a certified teacher can handle at the time. So once again, I'm just thinking, what does all this mean? And so you can kind of see it on this slide. I kind of put it in the gray area to be explicit. And I actually quoted Abraham Lincoln. I told Dr. Muller that I'd be doing that tonight because I just thought it was so appropriate. And so he once was quoted to say that there are no accidents in my philosophy. Every effect must have its cause. The past is the cause of the present, and the present will be the cause of the future. All these are links in the endless chain stretching from finite to the infinite. So there is this idea that what is currently taught in schools does not address what the citizenry should know. Does this mean that there is a real crisis, or what is trying to be said here? The legislative angle is interesting, and that is why we're here tonight. There seems to be a decrease in accountability on content knowledge across K-12 for social studies, evidenced by House Bill 3592, currently residing in the Senate Committee on Education relating to the statewide assessment program to promote student learning and student performance, but to remove social studies from among the assessed grades from 3 to 8. So there's that, but then there's an increase in specialized focus on founding fathers and explicit detailed attention to items that preserve dignity, and emphasis on avoiding topics that can cause discomfort on the basis of race, etc. Evidenced by the REACH Act, which addresses founding documents and how they should be taught in high school and higher education. House Bill 3002, which addresses the instruction on American founding principles, and Senate Bill 534, Restore America's Foundation Act. Civics education is in question through House Bill 4799, introduced not too long ago, which addresses critical race theory, which the League calls culturally inclusive history curriculum, and education funding that would be placed in question if you violate terms of the presented bill. It mentions that a teacher or student of history, civics, US government and politics, social studies, or similar subject areas, whether for regular credit or advanced placement credit, may not be compelled by a policy of a state agency, school district, school administration to discuss current events or widely debated and currently controversial issues of public policy or social affairs. And I want to read that last part again. They can't discuss current events or widely debated and currently controversial issues of public policy or social affairs. What are we doing tonight? These are the things that we want students to be talking about. So some might view this as a silencing, a hindrance for students to think critically about current events, the issues that they will have to soon vote with the knowledge of. So it's also important to just mention that in these courses, no school may make part of each course or award course grading or credit to student work for affiliation with or service learning in association with an organization engaged in lobbying for legislation in the local, state, or federal level, or in social or public policy advocacy. The irony is that the lack of support for civic action is, in this bill's, I would say, are compelling in their own right. I would argue that some of the language in these bills rebuke standards emphasized in K-12. So the legislation is broad and vague, which makes it highly restrictive. So at this point, what we'd like to do is pose a couple questions for you to start thinking about, okay, what do I even believe about what should be taught in schools? What do good citizens do? And then we want you to think about, okay, knowing what I know now, and I know I was talking pretty fast because we only have so much time tonight, but just to show you some of the things that are there, what can I do now? And so we're gonna proceed with our first breakout room. Rebecca, do you want to pose this question for our members?
Yeah, so Sharda kind of previewed this. In essence, we're going to have two different sessions, and they'll each breakout will focus on one of the topics. So the first question is a little bit more focused on the curriculum, and then the second is more focused on the proposed legislation. So what we'd like you to talk in this first breakout group is formulating your understanding of citizenship and civic education, right? So what do you think are the fundamental skills of a citizen? And I put that in quotes, what do good citizens do? And after talking about kind of your understanding of citizenship, do you see those kinds of skills and traits reflected in the curriculum, right? So the standards as it exists, does it communicate what you identify as the skills and traits of citizenship? So that'll be our first topic.
All right, so that is already placed in the chat. So as you get pushed into your breakout rooms, we're going to give you 10 minutes to discuss the answers to these questions.
And someone from the group will report out some key ideas.
Yeah, that would be great. So choose somebody to kind of speak on behalf of your group. Laura, are we ready to push them out?
You bet. Here we go.
All right.
So maybe we'll take a moment and if someone from each group might, we'll just kind of share out a highlight from your conversation about how you understand citizenship and if you think your understandings reflected in the standards as they exist.
I can start since we're all just jumping up and down. I just listening to Rebecca, you go over all the standards, and certainly all those things are important, you know, understanding what does it mean to follow rules when you're a younger child, to understanding the election process, or at least how this government is supposed to be run by representation. And the standards, this 2019 standards, just feel like, wow, that's pretty inclusive. But we did think that in actuality, when you're in a classroom, it depends on the teacher, and that, you know, what they pull to be as significant chunks of information, or how they go about doing it, you know, making it real, making it relatable. And definitely, I loved Amy, who said that the K through 2, that just seems to just hit it right on the nail on the head, just perfect. And then it just fades away from there. So I think that was everything. Did I get it all, teammates? Y'all jump in if I forgot something.
I'll jump in from that. Hey, everybody, I am Lawson Wetley, the default spokesperson for Group 3, because I couldn't twist anyone else's arm to do it. And for those who haven't met me, I, along with Susan Bell, am co-president of the Greenville League, and I'm so excited to see everybody here. We're just dying to see people in person, but so happy to be here. And just this event is so wonderful. Sharda, Rebecca, thank you all so much. Now, to jump from what Carol said, we felt similarly. What we focused on really was sort of, you know, do the standards reflect good citizenship? And I think what some of us really honed in on was what Dr. Muller had mentioned, and what Carol just mentioned as well, about how in kindergarten, it's very action focused, and then that kind of drops away as you get older. And just the notion that really the way to learn things is to do them, you know, rather than just to sort of read and reflect. So there was that. And we also touched a bit on, you know, talking about, were there curriculum standards relating to evaluating information and appropriate social media use? So we sort of immediately jumped off on what for me was a very interesting tangent. And by the way, gathered that that those are in the standards, but in the technology standards, not the social studies standards. So, and I can't resist mentioning too how excited I was that among our wonderful group was Janelle Rivers, where for people who haven't met Janelle, she is actually the League of Women Voter at the statewide levels, education volunteer lobbyist. So for everyone who hasn't said hey to Janelle, here's an opportunity.
Well, I'll speak for Group 4. This is Michelle Byrne, and I'm on the board for Greenville League and DEI chair. Work with Sharda on that. Thank you, Sharda and Rebecca, for doing this tonight. So some concepts that we talked about that for civics were concepts of citizenship, community, fairness, justice, equity versus equality. But then the other big thing, and I think Lawson, you talked about this as well, is media and information literacy. And Rebecca thought that it might be in the English standards as well, but the importance of knowing where you're getting your information from, and making sure that that's being taught and that students have that ability. So
That's great. That's a great point.
And I will speak for Group 5. Basically, the traits and skills of citizenship are being able to get at information and think about it critically and be able to know your source and your biases, which was said. And then good citizens get that information and act on it to vote appropriately and to make the changes in their government. And is that reflected in the curriculum? And it looks like it kind of fades off towards the end. I think I summarized our group. Oh, and I'm from Oconee Pickens.
Hello.
Oh,
Hey, Jane, do you have a report?
Yes. Hello. I'm Jane Hearn, and I'm from the Beaufort League, and wanted to meet with you tonight and hear this. It's very interesting. Group 2 also thought that the kindergarten through 2 was recognizing community and being active in it, that we thought that that was a great start. And then we started asking, well, what would be a good citizenship? And obviously voting came into play. And if they have SGA, or they voting for cheerleader or whatever they're voting for, they certainly know how that works to some degree. Service learning, we wondered whether they were involved in community projects that gave them the opportunity to work with a variety of people and give of themselves as volunteers. And then organizations, whether they were involved with Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, any other organizations that, like we used to, like YMCA and YWCA and things like that, that also had value systems that were very strong in supporting what the school taught. But we did think that it did fall away, and as it became obviously the teachers, up to the teacher to decide how to integrate all of these important factors. It's a lot to do. It's very difficult. That's it.
Thanks, Jane.
Mhm.
So I think that's a nice transition to the second question, because I think some of those issues of service learning and working with community organizations could potentially be up for debate, depending on how they're framed. So in the second breakout group, we'll turn our attention to the proposed legislation that Sharda reviewed. Do you think these bills would strengthen civic education? What do you think is missing? What would make them better? And we might not be able to make the argument, trash them if you feel that way. That might not be an option, right? So if it's about kind of working from what's there, how might we work from what's there?
And share our responses to the question that was posed in the chat on the screen. This time we only have 5 groups sharing out, which is good considering our time right now. Is there a group that wants to present first? We have 4.
I don't know what number I was, Sharda.
It's fine. I'll just count down. Once 4 people speak, I will assume that we are all represented.
Okay, Ruth Reed and I think Robin Tyndall were in our group. And it seems like the legislature's almost assuming that there will be coercion and compelling in the classroom. The onus seems to be on the teacher to prove that they are being objective. If a student believes a fact that needs correcting is not true, it's seen as how do you resolve that without claiming that the teacher won't let you voice your opinion? It's almost a form of intimidation, some of this legislation. And as if teaching isn't already hard enough and poorly paid enough, this will add a layer of kind of disrespect for the teaching profession. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Powerful points made.
I'll go next.
Okay, Janet.
Jan Welch, and we were in group 3. And we kind of said that it's seems to be a solution in search of a problem. and that it takes away from the professionalism that teachers have. And like was already said, there would be a burden put on the teachers. The most important point is that the league already has a position on this, and the position is that these kinds of decisions should be left up to local and state boards of education, not legislators. What I leave out, y'all?
Looks like they're satisfied, Janet.
Okay.
We'll see. The third group that would like to speak, Lawson?
I'll jump in now. So our answer to the question whether those bills would strengthen civic education was a unanimous no. In terms of, I'd love to start out with the easy ones, but and what we offered up as potential specifics for it, one suggestion was to remove the phrase about causing discomfort. For a couple of reasons, one of which is in the study of history, there are inherently uncomfortable things. And so by saying remove everything that is causing discomfort, that's more or less equivalent to saying we can't teach history. So it's just not a sustainable thing. And also, the better approach to it, rather than aiming to avoid uncomfortable topics, is to teach students how to address uncomfortable topics and how to process discomfort in a productive, civically minded way. Another suggestion was to remove the restriction on having representative groups that have a lobbying presence. Which after all would mean not allowing, for example, the League of Women Voters, or for example, a lot of environmental groups. And it was also noted that chances are that provision would die anyway once people realize that it also means you couldn't get input from, say, the Chamber of Commerce or any business group, right? That chances are the people who drafted that were not really thinking through what that means to bar that kind of participation. And a final suggestion that was made was to urge the lawmakers to get way more specific, that those bills are far too vague, and it, would effectively act as a vague threat of being held, as I think Jan may have mentioned as well, but a vague threat being held over teachers' heads. It's like, if you're going to make this a bill, be real specific about what its impact is going to be and what it means for a teacher to follow it. Group, did any additions to that?
All right.
Okay, last group. Y'all all covered everything. But one idea, Amy's so great. She talked me off the cliff, and she's like, well, we can't throw it off the table. It's there. So what could we do with it? And of course, there should be a challenge to what has been put out there. There should be additional legislation that's brought forth from the, common sense kind of things. But at the very least, Republicans are supposed to be known for their fiscal and their penny pinching and no taxes and watching the bottom line. And so the whole, having to report the curriculum that's being used and, all that filing that the teachers were going to have to do. And what are you going to do? You're going to scrap this curriculum that you just implemented this year? That doesn't make financial sense. And I don't see how they could just scrap all that material and research and training that they've just invested statewide with the stroke of a pen. That doesn't make sense. And who would be the gatekeeper for all those restrictions and all those requirements that the teachers they're going to tell teachers they have to do? Who's going to do that? That costs money. And if nothing else, money usually talks. So.
Wow, that's good, Carol. Thank you for contributing. We are getting close to 8 o'clock, and like we said, these are great discussions, but we have to end it at some point. I did want to reference someone's message in the chat where they asked CRTs, like how what do we call it at the league? It's culturally inclusive history curriculum. I would type it, but I don't want you to. Maybe somebody else can type it in the chat for me so I don't. Thank you. Culturally inclusive history curriculum. This is the same as CRT for our league. And the reason why we are veering away from that is because there's just so much misinformation out there. things that are meant to divide and really not actually teach people what it actually is and how, if this were to be taught in schools, I mean, it's just, there is a bit of inflation there in terms of CRT and what's actually occurring in schools. When Rebecca talked about what's being taught, critical race theory was not one of the things that she mentioned. And so once again, is this real? Is what we need to be asking ourselves. With that being said, I'm going to turn the floor over to Susan. You ready to close this out? Okay.
Thank you so much. I just real quickly want to thank Sharda and Rebecca for all the expertise they brought to us tonight. One of the things we always try to do with the league is to learn the facts, and you have given us a very good groundwork for understanding what the facts are and what's going on. And I think that's an invaluable place to start. We will continue to share information about this topic over the spring as it progresses. And I think all of you are already on our mailing list, but if you're not, you will be by the end of the week. So we really appreciate you joining us tonight. Some of you are familiar faces, some of you are new names and faces, and we appreciate whatever brought you to the meeting tonight. So thank you very much. Lawson, you had your hand up. Did you want to say anything? Okay.
No, that was a clapping emoji. I think I'm old. I don't know.
I'm not good with emojis. I'm too old for them. So anyway, thank you very, very much. And we'll follow up later in the week with a link to the recording. And I think Laura dropped our email address in the chat. So if you have any questions that you didn't get asked or you'd like follow up from, please feel free to drop us a note. So thank you very much. Great job, Sharda and Rebecca, and we hope we'll see you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.